So my topic is spooky teleology. First I'm going to make a pitch for teleology in general in philosophy, and then I'd like to investigate the metaphysics of spooky teleology. This is a technical term that I invented, and it's meant to refer to the kind of teleology that was repudiated by modern science, the kind of teleology that we do not believe in anymore. I'm going to claim that it's not entirely clear what it is, and as a result, it's not entirely clear how or why modern science would have repudiated teleology. So teleology in general means goal-directedness. It's often associated with phrases like for the sake of, or in order to, or the function of. Some examples: I exist for the sake of seeing, plants grow in order to nourish animals, the function of the heart is to circulate blood. Now, teleology, as the teleological view of nature, the idea that teleology is somehow central to the workings of nature, is supposed to be dead, and it's supposed to have been killed by modern science. There are various quotes that one can bring in here. Here's, for example, one of the less politically correct sayings of Francis Bacon: inquiry into final causes is sterile, and like a virgin consecrated to God, produces nothing. Here's a remark by Descartes: I consider the sort of cause which is customarily derived from an end to have no use in physics, for it is not without rashness that I think myself capable of investigating the ends of God. Descartes is also reported to have said the following: this rule, that we must never argue from ends, must be observed. For first, the knowledge of an end does not lead us to knowledge of the thing itself. Its nature is still hidden from us. Indeed, this is Aristotle's greatest fault, that he always argued from ends. Second, all the ends of God are hidden from us, and it is rash to want to delve into them. So teleology seems to have been killed by the pioneers of modern science, but at the same time, teleology is also, to some extent, still alive. I'm going to mention three areas where it seems to be alive: folk intuitions, the philosophy of biology, and the rest of philosophy. So first, folk intuitions. There seems to be quite a lot of evidence from psychology that people are prone to think teleologically. Here's the conclusion of a recent psychology paper: even if years of higher education generally reduce scientifically unwarranted teleological explanations of natural phenomena, an intuitive bias in favor of teleological explanations resolutely perseveres. Now, the authors based this conclusion on a survey in which they asked physical scientists as well as a control group whether they agree with claims like these: trees produce oxygen so that animals can breathe, germs mutate in order to become drug resistant, and so on. And they found that a sizable portion of scientists, as well as an even bigger portion of ordinary folk, accept such claims. There is similar evidence from experimental philosophy. For example, David Rose did a very interesting experiment in which he ran the ship of Theseus puzzle in such a way that teleological components were smuggled in. Here's one of the test cases that he used. John built his first rowboat, which he named Drifter, 30 years ago. It was an excellent rowboat. It was very stable, never let water in, and sailed smoothly. Over the years, there has been wear and tear, and so John, to keep it in perfect working order, has replaced various parts. Last month, John, realizing that he had accumulated enough old planks in his shed for a whole rowboat, took out his old plans for Drifter and assembled these planks exactly according to his old plans. This rowboat, however, worked terribly. It was very rickety, always let water in, and sank after just a few minutes in the water. And what Rose found was that in this specific case, people were inclined to say that the old planks boat is not identical to Drifter, rather the original Drifter, the original boat, rather the original boat is, in this case, is identical to the new planks boat. On the other hand, if the teleological scenario was turned around, if it was the old planks boat that preserved the function, if it worked much better than the one that was being repaired all the time, then people were inclined to say that it's the old Planck's boat that is identical to the original one. So it seems that people's judgments about persistence depends on function preservation, depends on a teleological component. Now, Rose hastens to add that folk intuitions are tied into a benighted view of nature, so he doesn't take this to be evidence that teleology is, in any sense, still relevant today. And indeed, later, he and Jonathan Schaeffer together argued that because of these experimental results, appealing to ordinary intuitions in the metaphysics of persistence or the metaphysics of mereological compositions, where similar results can be found, appeals to intuitions in those contexts in philosophy are illegitimate. So the idea is roughly folk intuitions are tainted by teleology. Teleology is bad. Therefore, we shouldn't appeal to folk intuitions. Now, whether or not that's a good argument, it seems to be a fact that teleology is present in the thinking of the folk. It's part of various ordinary intuitions. Now, teleology is also alive to some extent in philosophy itself, but not specifically in metaphysics. There's a small and very interesting cottage industry in the philosophy of biology that concerns the metaphysics of biological functions. A recent overview that I highly recommend for anyone who's not familiar with this area is Justin Garson's Critical Overview of Biological Functions. The main question in this area is how to make sense of claims like these. The function of the heart is to circulate blood. The function of zebra stripes is to deter flies. Biologists biologists do make such assertions, and the question is how to reconcile these claims or how to make sense of them in the context of the rest of modern biology. There are a lot of interesting options. I'm just going to mention one for the sake of an example. So one suggestion is that in order to explain what the function is or whether something has a function, you must look at the evolutionary history of the organism. For example, zebra stripes have a function if sometimes in the past striped zebras had an evolutionary advantage over unstriped zebras. There are a number of other options as well, but as far as I can see, this whole literature is concerned with reconciling function talk, which is a type of teleology talk, with forms of reductive naturalism. Now, teleology is also alive to some extent, or at least it's present, even if it's somewhat under the radar, in a number of other areas of philosophy as well, apart from philosophy of biology. For example, in philosophy of language, there are teleological theories of semantics. Ruth Millikan pioneered such a theory, and more recently, David Popinoe defended something along those lines. Issues about teleology are also present in the philosophy of action, where some people argue that intentional action cannot be reduced to any kind of efficient causation, and maybe some form of teleological causation can do the work better. It's also present in ethics, and it's obviously relevant in the philosophy of religion. Teleology, although it's dead, or it's generally considered to be dead, it's not totally dead. It's part of folk intuitions. It's present in a philosophy of biology, and it seems to be present in a number of other areas as well. As a result, it is in principle possible that teleology can be quite relevant in a number of different areas in philosophy. And for all we know, it could ground new forms of non-reductive physicalism or antiphysicalism. My third claim is that the metaphysics of teleology is terra incognita, except for a thin sliver of land, namely reductive naturalistic explanations of biological functions. This may be the result of the fact that teleology is generally thought to be dead, or strong forms of it are generally thought to be dead. As a result, people are not inclined to think about it. But as a result, I claim, we don't really know whether it is genuinely dead and whether it could still be an option, either in non-deductive naturalistic views or or as the basis of new forms of antiphysicalism. So I think that's all I wanted to say as an introduction. The main claim is that teleology seems to be a notion that can be useful in a number of different philosophical areas, and we're not entirely clear on the metaphysics of it. And the rest of the talk is meant to be an illustration of point 3, namely that the metaphysics of teleology, of the kind of teleology that is supposed to be dead, is far from being clear. So now coming on to the actual talk. The main question here is, what exactly was killed by modern science? What is spooky teleology, or what would it be if it existed? Now, those who are knowledgeable about contemporary metaphysics have noticed that there has been a revival of Aristotelianism in contemporary analytic metaphysics. So one potential first best answer to this question, the question of what spooky teleology is that, well, it's whatever those crazy neo-Aristotelians talk about. And before I go into specific suggestions about spooky teleology, I'd just like to indicate that it doesn't seem to me that the contemporary neo-Aristotelian literature doesn't seem to me to be of too much help when it comes to understanding the metaphysics of teleology. For example, in William Jaworski's book on the hyalomorphic theory of the mind, the word teleology doesn't even occur, as far as I can tell. In the collection edited by Thomas Tuckle, Contemporary Aristotelian Metaphysics, the word teleology occurs 5 times, twice in the bibliography, once in a footnote, and 2 times in passing in a paper about the philosophy of biology. And I see similar patterns in other collections of neo-Aristotelian papers. So the metaphysics of teleology doesn't seem to be per se one of the central themes in neo-Aristotelian metaphysics today, as far as I can tell, but I may very well be wrong about that. And I hope you will correct me in the Q&A session if I am. So I'm now going to look at a few candidate definitions of spooky teleology to illustrate that this notion is far from clear, and as a result, it's far from clear how modern science repudiated the old teleological view of nature. So here's the simplest suggestion I can think of. Spooky teleology is simply animism. Something is a teleological system aimed at a goal if it literally wants to bring about that goal. Now, it seems to me quite clear that nobody who was ever serious about teleology was an animist. It's not like Aristotle thought that plants are literally thinking about ways of surviving or flourishing, and that's why they develop in various ways. So I think animism is clearly out of the picture, even though it's sometimes associated with teleology. For example, the psychology paper that I quoted earlier by Kellerman and his co-authors seems to associate teleology with animism. A slightly more sophisticated suggestion is that teleology, spooky teleology, has to do with objective purposes. Something is a teleological system with a certain goal if its objective purpose is to bring that goal about or to reach that goal. Now, the question here is what one means by objective purposes. Once animism is out of the picture, the notion of purpose must be used analogically. So we're not literally talking about purposes, we're talking about something else. And the question is what that something else is. Without some explanation of the content of this analogy, this theory is not really a theory, I think. Now, the only way that I can think of to flesh it out is to invoke powers or dispositions. Some people associate powers or dispositions with physical intentionality. This is supposed to be something analogous to mental intentionality, to the intentionality that characterizes mental states and volitional states. But it's supposed to be present in inanimate nature as well. So the idea is that if something has a real power or disposition, then it is aimed or directed at a certain state. For example, negatively charged particles are directed at or aiming at attracting positively charged particles. Or the magnet is directed at or aimed at attracting metallic objects. And one could try to make sense of objective purposiveness by saying that something has an objective purpose if it has a certain power or disposition that is aimed at the end state in question. My problem with this suggestion is that I don't see why the idea that something, let's say that a seed has the power or disposition to grow into a tree, I don't see why that claim would be contrary to the spirit of modern science. That doesn't seem to need to be a claim that has been decisively repudiated by science. There is nothing spooky about this claim as far as I can see. If I put on my reductive naturalist hat, I can still agree that the seed has the power or disposition to grow into a tree. Even if I think of the seed as a mere conglomerate of molecules or what have you, I can still say that, well, sure, it's disposed to grow into a tree. That's what those molecules do when they come together. So in order to turn this, turn the power-based definition into a definition of spooky teleology, something else must be added. For example, one could add that the power in question is irreducible or fundamental or emergent, something like that. But if one does that, and that's presumably something that is a little bit contrary to what most people think about modern science. So presumably seeds do not have a fundamental power of growing into a tree, because some sort of microreduction seems to be more plausible, according to many people at least. So one can get some sort of conflict between spooky teleology and modern science there. But then spookiness in this picture, in the resulting picture, comes from this extra ingredient, fundamentality or emergence or reduction or irreducibility. And the powers or dispositions, as far as I can see, do no real work per se in the resulting definition. So if spookiness comes from irreducibility or fundamentality or emergence, then I don't see how powers or dispositions are still important in the metaphysical picture. So I'm inclined to move on and look for something else. I'm now going to look at a very interesting paper by John Hawthorne and Daniel Nolan. It's called What Would Teleological Causation Be? Their goal is explicitly to make sense of something like Aristotle's notion of teleological causation in the context of contemporary analytic metaphysics. So they don't want to engage in historical exegesis, but they are after some concept that is relevantly similar to Aristotle's, and one that is formulated in contemporary terms. Their example concerns a very simple system, a rock. We're assuming that the rock has a teleological nature. It has a natural place, namely the center of the earth, and it seeks to return to its natural place whenever it's displaced from it. We're assuming that we're suspending the rock above a well, and we're also assuming there are certain constraints that apply to this system. So there are certain things that the rock is unable to do. For example, it cannot burrow through earth. It cannot teleport to the center of the earth and things like that. So there are certain constraints operating when it comes to its movement. Taking those constraints into account, there are a number of paths that the rock could in principle take. Here are some of them. And we want to construct a definition that tells us which path the rock is going to take, assuming that it is teleological in the sense indicated. Now, the first suggestion that Nolan and Hawthorne examine is something like this. The rule is to take the quickest path, the one that takes you to the center of the earth quicker than any of the other paths, or at least as quickly as any of the other paths. This is not exactly the way Nolan and Hawthorne frame it. They talk about end velocity, but I don't think that those details are very important here. Given this rule, it follows that the rock will just go straight down into the well, because that's the path that takes it quickest toward the center of the earth. Here's a problem, though. Suppose that there's a bucket suspended in the well, and the rock is going straight toward it. If the take the quickest path rule were correct, then the rock should do something like this. It should go around the bucket and continue its descent toward the center of the earth as long as it can go into the well. But well, that's not what rocks actually do. So if we want to make sense of actual rocks in teleological terms, to the extent that we can, then this quickest path definition of teleology won't work. So the definition that Nolan and Hawthorne end up with is something like this. At any time t, the rock will follow a continuation of its path in such a way that for some period after t, the rock has greater end velocity, moves faster toward its goal than it would have on any alternative path that is compatible with the constraints. And this rule will entail that the rock will go straight down into the bucket, that it will follow first the red line and then the blue arrow instead of going sideways, roughly because its velocity, the speed at which it is approaching the center of the earth, is greater on the blue path than on the red one that goes sideways. I think this is a very nice attempt at capturing teleology at the greatest possible level of generality. But unfortunately, this definition seems to me to be open to counterexamples. Here are two. I'm going to describe two alien rocks. The first is our red rock. It does the following. If you release it above the ground, it starts falling down at an accelerating rate. Then it suddenly jumps upward towards the moon. Then it jumps back and continues its descent toward the ground, and it jumps again towards the moon a little. It gets a little bit closer to the moon, and then just before it would reach the ground, it will teleport to the moon and remain there. Now, I'll claim that to the extent that rocks can be teleological, this rock is the goal of this rock is to reach the moon. It seems to be gravitating towards the moon. If you assume that this sort of behavior is stable, it always ends up in the moon sooner or later, then it's safe to say that to the extent that it's teleological, its goal is to reach the moon. But it seems to be, according to the Hawthorne Nolan definition, its goal is to reach the Earth, simply because it satisfies the criterion. If we specify the constraints carefully enough, it will satisfy the criterion that it always, at any moment in time, it always chooses a path whose it always chooses a path on which its speed towards the Earth or towards the ground is greater than on any other available path. And similarly, one can imagine another stone, a purple stone, that wants to go to the ground, but according to the Hawthorne Nolan definition, its goal is to reach the moon. It all depends on setting up the constraints in such a way that the Hawthorne Nolan definition is satisfied in such a way that it shouldn't be. And as a result, one can reply that, well, one shouldn't fiddle around with the constraints. All these constraints that I set up are too ad hoc, or that they all depend on the possibility of moving this continuously and so on. But I think that once one builds into one's definition of teleology such epicycles, namely no discontinuous motion and no fiddling around with the constraints and so on, then the resulting concept becomes unclear, and it becomes, to my mind, questionable whether it captures the general notion of teleology. I mean, to my mind, these alien rocks are logically possible, and they seem to the extent that rocks can have goals, they seem to have a certain kind of goal, which is not captured by the Hawthorne Nolan definition. So I'm inclined to say that the Hawthorne Nolan definition doesn't help us get a clear grip on spooky teleology. My second example from current metaphysics comes from Mark Bedau, who is one of the very few people in the philosophy of biology who are arguing for a conception of functions in which value is explicitly invoked. Here's one of his definitions of his preferred conception of teleology or functions. XFs in order to G, if and only if XFs, because Fing contributes to Ging and Ging is good. For example, the heart beats in order to circulate blood, if and only if the heart beats because its beating contributes to circulating the blood, and circulating the blood is good, namely for the organism. So the good of the organism or something in general is invoked in the analysis of teleological causation. Now, I find this analysis very helpful and highly intuitive. But when I put on my metaphysician's hat, I get worried because I start to feel unsure what the metaphysical upshot of this claim of the right-hand side of this biconditional is. And my problem is specifically with the word because. I'm not sure what because is meant to refer to here. I don't think it can refer to causation or causal relation because on the right-hand side of because, we have a general fact. The beating of the heart contributes to circulating the blood. That's some sort of nomic regularity or something like that. And I'm not aware of any contemporary accounts of causation, and I cannot myself think of any new account on which such general facts could be causes. I just don't see how the fact that the beating of the heart tends to contribute to circulating the blood in the right circumstances. I just can't see how a general fact like that can be a cause. So I don't think that this because is causal. What else can it be? Perhaps it signals some sort of causal explanation. Bedau mentions explanation throughout the paper, so perhaps that's his own default view. But that doesn't help me with the metaphysics of it, because, well, what is causal explanation supposed to be? If it's related to the way that we're inclined to try to make sense of things or something like that. So if it has to do with our cognitive capacities, then it doesn't help me with the metaphysics of objective worldly teleology. On the other hand, if causal explanation means simply uncovering the nexus of causal relations or something like that in the world, then we're back to the previous problem, namely that then this claim is supposed to be some sort of causal claim, and then we're supposed to explain how a general fact, like the fact that the beating of the heart contributes to circulating blood, is supposed to be a cause. The last option that I can see is that this because signals metaphysical explanation. Some people think that metaphysical fundamentality and metaphysical grounding should be understood in terms of metaphysical explanation. So, for example, the physical, the mental is, let's take the definition of physicalism, which says that the mental is grounded in the physical. And on the understanding of grounding that I'm talking about, this claim means that the mental is explained by the physical in some metaphysically significant sense. In our case, in the case of teleology, the claim would be that something has a function, performs a function, or behaves teleologically if its activity is grounded in the right-hand side of this definitions. So, for example, the fact that the heart beats is grounded in the fact that its beating contributes to circulating the blood, and circulating the blood is good. My issue with this definition of spooky teleology is, again, that its spookiness is completely non-obvious to me. That is, I don't see how the claim that the beating of the heart, the fact that the heart beats, is grounded in the fact that it's good for the organism or something like that. I don't see whether that's really antithetical to modern science. I just can't tell whether that's something that modern science decisively repudiated. I think that depends on whether one thinks that science is in the business of uncovering grounds, and if it is, are the grounds that it has uncovered incompatible with the idea that the heart beats because it's good for the organism? I just don't see how to go about answering these questions, and as a result, I don't see this definition, this grounding-based definition of spooky teleology, as helping us understand spooky teleology and its conflict with modern science. Now, in closing, I'd like to offer my own alternative. It's very experimental, and it's a very lightweight notion of teleology that is based on the work of Richard Braithwaite. Braithwaite, in his teleological explanation paper, described teleology as a form of plasticity. One of his examples is a rat in a maze. If you put the rat in a maze, it finds the food. But there are very different ways you can build up the maze, and there are different pieces of food that you can put at the center of the maze, and the rat will continue to find it. So when we talk about the goal-seeking behavior of the rat in the maze, we're talking about a very wide set of possible situations in which the rat will do one specific thing, namely it will find the food. So it's a little bit like some notion of multiple realizability. There are, if you vary the context in all sorts of different ways, the end result, the end state, nonetheless remains pretty much the same. So the realization of the end state is plastic in the sense that you can vary the context, and the end state is still there. So the end state is stable under changes of the context, even relatively radical changes. I'm going to use this concept and some other things that Braithwaite does not build into his own account. My starting point is the notion of a configuration space. Suppose we have a rat, a one-dimensional rat that lives on a line. And there's also a piece of food somewhere on the line. The system can be represented by a two-dimensional configuration space. One dimension is the position of the food, and the other dimension is the position of the rat. Every point in this abstract space corresponds to a logically possible state of the system, namely it specifies where the rat is and where the food is. And every line in this configuration space corresponds to a logically possible process within the system. So for example, the blue lines represent trajectories where the rat is moving towards the food. The red line represents a trajectory where the rat is moving, where the rat and the food are both moving towards each other, and then they pass each other and continue on moving. The rat is moving in the negative direction, and the food is moving in the positive direction. Now, presumably that's not a nomologically possible trajectory in this, but it's logically possible given this configuration space. Now I'm going to say that something is directed at some end state. For example, the rat is directed at finding the food. If those trajectories in the configuration space that end in the end state, for example, the rat's finding the food, form a natural resemblance class. I'm going to be as neutral here as possible. By natural, the term natural is supposed to be the same that Lewis uses when he defines natural properties. He says that sharing of natural properties makes for qualitative similarity. Natural properties carve at the joints, they are intrinsic, they are highly specific, the sets of their instances are ipso facto not entirely miscellaneous. So it's supposed to capture some real pattern out there in nature that unifies all these different possible trajectories. So for example, if in all nomologically possible cases, what happens is that the rat ends up on the 45-degree line, namely that it ends up at the same place where the food is, then it's obviously directed at G because, well, it's pretty much nomologically necessary that it will seek out and locate the food. So that's one way of forming a natural resemblance class, but there could be lots of other ways in which trajectories form a natural resemblance class. It captures something about the behavior, some pattern that is very robust and perhaps contributes to kind membership and things and so on. I'm trying to be, as I said, as neutrally as possible because I don't want to commit to any specific account of natural kinds or properties or what have you. Now, the second component of my definition of spooky teleology is plastic directedness. Something is plastically directed at a goal, or an end state, if it is directed at the state, and the trajectory is starting from diverse parts of X's configuration space and in G. So the idea here is what Braithwaite was talking about, namely that there are many different contexts in which the system will end up in the end state in question. You can put the rat in all sorts of different mazes, and you can put in all sorts of different food that it likes. It will still find it. So that these trajectories are coming from all over the place in configuration space. That's the idea behind plasticity. I need two other notions. One is the notion of irreducible directedness. Something is irreducibly directed at an end state if the fact that it is directed at it is not reducible to any other effects. No surprises here. The last component is intrinsic directedness. Something is intrinsically directed at an end state if every duplicate of it is directed at it. And my proposed definition of spooky teleology is irreducible intrinsic plastic directedness. And one can define a related notion of domesticated teleology, which would be reducible or reducible and extrinsic plastic directedness. So I claim that one way of understanding spooky teleology, the kind of teleology that is supposed to have been refuted by modern science, is to think of it as an irreducible intrinsic tendency to reach a certain end state, no matter the circumstances. Now, this is, of course, very strong. Circumstances matter a lot. But the idea is that, there's a sufficiently wide range of circumstances in which the end state is reached. That set is so wide that the end state is important when we consider the set of trajectories in question as forming a natural resemblance class. So the goal is somehow a unifying factor, and the fact that the system or entity or whatever tends to reach that goal is an intrinsic property of it, and it's not reducible to anything else. And in comparison to this, to the extent that modern naturalistic views recognize teleology, they tend to go for reducible or preferably reducible and extrinsic forms of plastic directedness. So, for example, to the extent that biologists nowadays are inclined to take claims about function seriously, they want to reduce their existence to the microparts of organisms, and they often treat facts about performing functions as extrinsic. That's the case, for example, in the theory that I mentioned earlier, the theory on which, for example, hearts or zebra stripes have functions in virtue of the evolutionary history of the organism. That's obviously extrinsic to any given organism, and it's presumably also reducible to facts that have nothing to do with functions. So as far as I can see, spooky teleology has to do with irreducibility, irreducible intrinsicness, the irreducible and intrinsic nature of certain plastic directed systems or phenomena, and its domesticated versions are trying to get rid of either its intrinsicness or its irreducibility. I think I'll stop here and open up the floor to any questions.
I really like the talk, especially the last part about this directed thing, this plastic directedness. And I just wanted to ask you about the possible motivations of this thought, or you know, I just want to raise some topics that are quite close to this idea. So the first thing is in cybernetics in the 60s and from the 60s to the 80s. Many people worked on things like phototaxis and things, basic mechanisms that somehow realize a system that has this kind of plastic directedness, so they can avoid obstacles and all that. And one of my first thoughts was when you introduced the whole context is the following weird thing. Now, in philosophy of biology, it's really widespread. Just everybody talks about teleology and function. And there are lots of papers on that. But it's usually in the context of evolutionary development. So, you know, basically the reason why a trait is present is a backwards history. Yeah, it's produced by natural selection and stuff. In those cases, basically, the reason why you attribute a function to something is its past. It doesn't really have to have a function at present, by the way. So, the whole story about evolutionary developed functions, or teleology, if you want, is such that the idea of an evolutionary function basically supervenes on the past of the organism, and not on the immediate present. So you might have an organ that at present doesn't really serve any function, but is still there because natural selection preferred it for a long time and selected it to become, you know, this and that. So that's a really interesting thing, because that's not really the strongest sense of teleology for sure. It's a version of teleology that you can reduce to causal notions, and basically you go back to the past and utilize information about the past of the organism to justify your teleological claims. Now, in cybernetics, this wasn't really the case. So cybernetics is about governance. The word cybernetics basically comes from the Greek word that means that. And so they try to build systems that can control themselves by, you know, avoiding obstacles, by following targets and all that. And the basic, really primitive sensors in these old cybernetics experiments basically define the goals of the system. And that's something that's really doing its job. So if you build a small, I don't know what, just a small car, which has phototaxis. So it is a small motor, it goes in a certain direction, and it recognizes the incoming light. And when it's strong enough, then it goes towards the light. When it's not strong enough, then it tries to change direction. That's it, basically. Something like that. It's a basic rule. And it really provides this kind of behavior you mentioned. Mm-hmm. It's the kind of behavior you described, the plastic kind of directedness, something. Now, it's interesting to ask, why do we think that this system has this function? You might want to think that it has it because of, you know, the designer, or because of evolutionary history again, or whatnot. But if anything has anything like a teleological property, if property is the right word to use in this context, then these things that have this behavior are those things that we really somehow single out as teleologically interesting things. I have some thoughts about the cybernetics case as well, but let me just mention another thing. There are some experimental cognitive psychologists who are working on causation. Maybe you know some of these guys. James Woodward and his, his company was really interested in how their causal models can be utilized in developmental psychology and stuff. Now, they, there are these classic examples in the context of counterfactual theories of causation, like double prevention and all of these things. And some of these cognitive psychologists started to do the following thing. They described double prevention scenarios for people, but with a different content. So in the first possible scenario, you have two agents, two people doing something, and then one is a preventer of the action of the other. So there's I don't know, there are two planes, a bomber, it's followed by a fighter plane. It tries to catch it, but another fighter plane comes in and shoots down the fighter plane that endangered the bomber. That's a classic example. You have agents there. What basically the psychologists ask from people is, what do they think? Is there a causal connection in some sense in this scenario? And funnily, when there are agents in the scenario, people tend to think the double prevention works perfectly and it's a causal scenario. But if you start to use scenarios where there are billiard balls, even better if you have some rocks falling on a mountainside, and they are kicking each other according to the basic scenario. That's a double prevention scenario as well. Then people start to dismiss the idea that this is really a causal relation we are talking about there. So there's a robust difference between those who find the original fighter plane scenario causal, and there's a really small minority relative to the other who thinks that the falling rocks on the mountainside are really doing something causal, when the only way to describe their causal relationship is a kind of double prevention scenario. What's interesting is, if there are agents in there, then you think that, okay, there's a connection between those fighter planes. What's the connection really? It's exactly what you are talking about, the plastic directedness of the fighter plane. So I know that the first fighter plane really had this idea in mind of shooting down the plane, the bomber plane. And then I know that it will work like that. So it will be directed for a long while till it has, I don't know, ammunition in the guns or whatever. It will be directed at the bomber, and it will try to do the best it can to shoot down the plane. And you know, the teleological attribution that people usually make, and this is basically how we understand agents, doesn't require you to have a successful, intervention. So it might be that the plane was shot by another plane and never been able to carry out its, aim to shoot down the bomber. But we still know that it was after the other plane, because we saw the behavior. It was adjusting its behavior according to changes in weather and the trajectory of the bomber and all that. So this plastic directedness, interestingly, if it's attributable to something in a causal scenario, even if it's causal disconnection, basically there is no physical connection between the different events in such a scenario, and people tend to think that there's a connection. And the connection is that the perceiver, the first fighter plane pilot, the perceiver knew about the plane and wanted to follow it. And then I think even the most primitive, and then I'm getting back to cybernetics, even the most primitive systems that do this are really interesting for us. Then again, some cognitive psychologists at the CEU, Gergely György and Csibra Gergely, were doing a lot of experiments with small children, where they try to figure out how children make a difference between inanimate and animate objects. And one of the most important things they do is, they just show some billiard balls on a screen, and whenever those balls are going in a linear way, well, the kid just takes a look at it. Okay, it's not interesting. It just went like that. And then you put in a billiard ball that somehow goes around an obstacle, and then wow, something happened there, really. So, my comment in a shorter version of my comment would be simply this: I think in cybernetics, some early pioneers really tried to define this kind of thing as teleology, and I think that it might be a better place to go than evolutionary biology if you want to talk about things like basically your ideas are much more well-grounded in that field than in evolutionary biology.
Thank you so much. Yeah, there was a lot of information there. Thank you. And a lot of references that I will be able to use. I'm going to go now to Kenneth Silver.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks for your talk. I appreciated it.
Thank you.
Yeah, so my question is, I guess I had a nascent idea of what I thought spooky causation was. And I guess I'm wondering how, if you just don't like this kind of conception, or if you think if there's a way to kind of like put it in your picture. And it would be something like spooky final causation is efficient causation, but it's backwards efficient causation.
All right.
It's backwards causation by something that doesn't even exist yet. And that's kind of what's so spooky about it. It's sort of like a calling forth into existence by a thing that doesn't yet exist. And that's kind of like, I guess, my nascent picture of how I think of it. And I guess I'm wondering whether or not you can accommodate, and I think there is a way on your picture that you can accommodate it. And I guess I'm wondering how you feel about it. And I guess the way that you could accommodate it is you could say, well, I said that it's not reducible. I forget exactly the frame you used: plastic, intrinsic, directed, non-reducible. Right?
Yeah, something like that. Irreducible directedness, that's plastic and intrinsic.
Yeah, maybe you could say something like, oh, the spooky version is one in which it is reducible, but it's reduced to this kind of backwards efficient causation. People don't, there's no good reason to think that that's the case. So, that's why, better versions of it these days reduce it to efficient causation of things in the past. Would you be amenable to that, or do you think, no, it's actually better to frame the spookiness as in terms of irreducibility?
I like the idea of backward causation very much. I find it a very cool notion. There's even an interpretation of quantum mechanics based on backward causation called the transactional interpretation. So it could even be relevant in philosophy of science, this idea. I haven't seen, I don't know if you yourself have written about this, the backward causation version of final.
I think about it, but no, I haven't. I mean,
I haven't seen anywhere in the literature spelled out in detail. And one of the objections that I found in the Hawthorne Nolan paper that seemed to be quite strong was that a process can be teleological without actually reaching its goal. And there, as far as I can see, there cannot be backward causation without the cause in the future being actually there. So even if some versions, for example, divine final causation, I guess, could work like that if somehow God acts from the future. But anything that's not nomologically as robust as God, anything that can accidentally fail to materialize, will be unable to ground. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I'll just say as a quick kind of response, what this kind of suggests is having to deal with some kind of analog of the bilking worry. If you're thinking about backwards causation, one worry is that how could you cause something to be different in the past that would make it such that you wouldn't actually be doing the cause, something that undermines my causing right now of something in the past. It's the bilking worry for backwards causation. And you might think that the problem you just gestured to sounds like the same problem. It's interesting.
That's interesting. That's an interesting dialectic. So I'm curious I mean, I don't feel any strong inclination to develop it myself, but I find it extremely interesting. We have two written questions. I read the first one is from Eric Akerlund. Thanks for the talk. Could you say something about how your suggestion on plasticity relates to Aristotle's account of finality based on an act potency scheme? It seems that dynamism could be a key word for each of the two suggestions. Yeah, I confess I'm at a complete loss there because I don't understand Aristotle well enough to see how that's related to. Basically, my goal was to develop a notion that captures roughly the same kind of phenomena that Aristotle seems to be talking about, but I don't know how the fine details of the two conceptions are related. Can anyone offer anything from the panel?
I just try to say something about it. So in a nutshell, I think this act potency shame can come into the picture if we think that it kind of potency in a thing is not just a mere disposition, but what Daniel said before, that it's a strong disposition to be something. But I think so I think Daniel's theory seems to be a bit different than Aristotle's theory, because I think Daniel tries to focus on different kind of possible words when he tries to speak about plasticity, and I think Aristotle was preoccupied with the actual word, and I think Daniel's theory is not too Aristotelian, but it's just my intuition.
Martin?
I'm also no Aristotle scholar, but I wondered if a point of contact might be with Danny's use of the notion of a configuration space, given that a configuration space is an arrangement of kind of the possibilities of the system, which seems to line up, at least in some sense, with the kind of potentialities that the system might have, whereas act could be perhaps correlated in an interesting way with the trajectories or paths through that configuration space that Danny was picking up on as being kind of privileged in a certain sort of respect when they're goal directed. So again, there's no, I don't think there's a particularly direct connection here, but I wonder if the kind of general notion of potency or potentiality that Aristotle's pointing to in the act potency distinction is one that Danny's also taking advantage of in providing a structure using configuration space.
Can I add something here?
Please.
So the configuration space idea just gave me another idea. So thanks for that. And so somehow there's this discussion of complexity in life that goes back basically to Schrödinger, and it's a more word out thing nowadays, but it says something like this: a living system, and then we can go back to your directed plasticity with this. So a living system, it enters a configuration space if you want, will show a really kind of weird behavior. And weirdness simply this: every other thing in the system, if those are not living things, will behave in more or less accordance with the second law of thermodynamics. Everything will conform to the principle of least action. Will stop somewhere when, you know, in this energy sense, it's the most stable state of the system. And what happens when you bring in something that lives is that you get loads of extra energy in the system. So overall, something comes in that it's not that easy, and I'm not a real physicist, unfortunately, but I will try another angle on this. So simply, it will bring in extra energy in a way that when you observe the behavior that's caused by this energy, then you won't see the principle of least action, at least on the face of it, to work in the system. Does this make clear, or is this really clear, or should I try to formulate it in a different manner?
I'm sorry to be brutal, but I think we should go on to other questions, because we have 3 other. But I think that, sorry, I'm not trying to be destructive. I think that you're raising a very, fine. So this whole principle of least action issue is very relevant here, I think, and its relation to dispositional accounts of nature. But I think that's a topic that deserves a whole seminar on its own. So.
Probably, I'm sorry.
No, that's. We have another raised hand. Who?
Okay, so I would like to say 2 things very shortly. The one is about your puzzlement about because, which I didn't really understand. I mean, why should the because understood in causal terms or in terms of metaphysical grounding only? Because is a general explanatory notion. And if teleological explanations are explanations, we can use because, no problem why. And if they are, and if we want to say that because is essentially related to some form of causation, like probably Aristotle thought, then we should also go with him and say that, of course, there are many forms of causation, as there are many forms of explanations. So I didn't see really the puzzle here. But the other thing I wanted to mention is the notion of directedness, because it is, as you mentioned, has been brought up in context of debates on powers and dispositions, and historically one of the sources of considering teleology spooky seems to me, and this is not my invention, you know, I just read it in other history of philosophy books, is that at the period, I mean, 16th, 17th, 18th century, people really love to talk about occult powers as occult qualities, but it's very, you know, it's always puzzled me why a power is occult quality. It's not a quality, it's a power, that's the point. But they understood it's occult quality because they somehow thought that powers are directed at something, and directedness entails intentionality, and intentionality entails conscious representations. And that's what makes the whole story, you know, very spooky, if you like, and that's what makes things occult. But but that's just a historical. This is just a historical point. I can recommend literature on that if you are interested in that, because, as I said, it's not my interpretation. It was just very revelative to me because I understood why they use this occult quality vocabulary. Mm-hmm. What I wanted to ask really is the nature of directedness and plasticity, okay? Because there is a sense in which, as you said, dispositions can be understood as being directed at something, okay? So I don't really like that interpretation of powers and dispositions, but, you know, there is a vague sense in which at least some dispositions are directed to certain events, okay? And I don't think that this is sufficient for all dispositions being teleological. Actually, I do believe that there are teleological dispositions, but that's another story. But the directedness itself doesn't seem to me sufficient for this. Now you add plasticity, anyway, you know what I mean, to this criteria. But I was just wondering what happens, for instance, with the compass. The compass, it's very plastically shows towards the north. Okay, no, in various circumstances, not always, of course. It can be, there are circumstances in which it fails, but various compasses, various circumstances will always show towards the north. So I see that the thing, your conditions are more or less satisfied in the case of at least some power-like, dispositional-like properties as well, which I, for one, at least, wouldn't classify as teleological disposition, as the rat's disposition to get to the cheese. And I can tell you what I'm missing. Okay, so of course you can say that, okay, but this is the compass is not directed to a goal, okay, because the goal is not there. But that seems to be a little bit cheating, because of course, if you talk about goals, you already introduce the idea of teleology. So it's better not to introduce it. And the last thing about this, so I as a personal remark, I actually worry a bit about this, because I myself had that sort of view, or a very similar, not exactly, but a very similar view of teleology, which is based on directedness plus some extra conditions. And now I think I changed my mind on that, because I think that it's not going to be sufficient. And what else I think should be added, I'm not telling you, because probably that's not, you're not interested in anything. I just wanted to raise this issue about this kind of approach to what makes teleology. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would be very much interested in your own current view. I'm going to reply only to the last part of the comment regarding the compass, because the issues about because and the other one raised, it will be complicated to address all of these at once, and we still have 2 more questions. So regarding the compass, I think that's a very good objection, and some similar objections have been raised or were raised against Braithwaite originally. I think one example is a rock rolling down into a valley, so you can release the rock at various points on top of the valley, and it will always roll towards the bottom. So why isn't that teleological? There are 2 replies to these sorts of objections that I'm experimenting with. The first is to bite the bullet and say that, yeah, that's a form of teleology, but it's a very primitive one. So here the idea would be that teleology comes in degrees, and the really interesting forms of it are the strong forms, which are characterized by a large degree of plasticity, which is, well, perhaps one can argue that it's the behavior of the rock is not very plastic, because it can be described by a few relatively simple rules. The second possible reply that I'm thinking of is to say that the natural resemblance class that includes the behavior of the compass includes lots of other things as well, which are not teleological. So if you describe the nature of magnetism, you describe what compasses do. And if the nature of magnetism by itself is not teleological according to my criterion, then one can just say, well, the compass appears to be teleological if you don't know the laws of magnetism or something like that. But once you realize what sort of natural classes that system is part of, then this apparent teleology disappears.
Okay, I have answers, but I don't want to continue, so
okay, all right.
I would like to let other people.
Yeah, thank you. Let's continue that.
Because I have lots to say about natural classes, which I really distrust. And it's not clear to me why it is not clear about magnets in general. I'm just using an easy example, but in a more sophisticated formulation, I think it's to just anything which is magnetic, but never mind. I mean, thank you for it.
No, thank you for the question. There was a written question in the chat box from Shivanand Sharma. I'm going to read it. Thank you for your very insightful and informative presentation. I appreciate it very much. You mentioned that teleology is still a live issue in philosophy of religion. Would it be correct to say that teleological explanations in philosophy of religion can be categorized in two domains, one relating to living organisms and two relating to inanimate objects? And that in the first, teleological explanations typically appeal to the activity of souls or consciousness, while teleological explanations in the second typically appeal to laws of nature. I ask this because I am currently researching how to characterize the notion of Brahman from Indian philosophy using the language of contemporary metaphysics, where Brahman is taken to be the ultimate ground of reality and which is taken to be fundamentally conscious. I'm wondering if teleology needs to be incorporated somehow into this characterization. Sorry if this question is slightly off topic, but I am curious what insights you might be able to give. My reply here will be similar to my reply to Eric's question regarding Aristotle, so I'm going to confess ignorance. So this is an area that I and we would like to explore in the coming months, in the next year or so. I think this is one of the aims of the projects, to look at the relevance of metaphysics of teleology in the philosophy of religion. My impression is, well, first of all, my work on in the philosophy of religion is confined pretty much to the problem of evil. So I can't say that I know the field well enough to make sweeping generalizations about it. But to the extent that I know the field, teleology doesn't seem to me to be, at least in the contemporary scene, to be invoked too much. So my impression is that this is also a sort of terra incognita.
So it's a little bit different, but so evidently there is a subfield in which teleology is very prominent. It's teleological arguments and for and against God, and in this context, it seems that, for example, the laws of nature seems to be the explanatory tool, which is not teleological one, and God seems to be the one which provide some kind of teleological explanation for things. So that's the only thing. So I had this impression that laws of nature, they in most cases they are understood as if they were not teleological kind of explanations. So I think that's just a little remark.
Tamás?
Thank you. I just have two short questions, and I hope that they make sense and that they are relevant. In the beginning, you said that if we were to understand teleology as power or disposition, then it would have no problem with science or today's science, and it wouldn't rule it out. And you said that then we would have to add something so that it becomes incompatible with today's science. And you said that if we understand them to be irreducible or non-reductible powers or dispositions, then we have a problem and some tension with science, with the natural sciences. I was just thinking that if we reduce all organisms and everyday objects to elementary particles, and if we say that these elementary particles themselves have a kind of irreducible or a primitive property of having a telos or having an end, then whether that would be also incompatible with science. And my second question is stems from the idea of entropy, that all things in this universe are to be dissolved and be annihilated at the end of the universe, or at the end of the world. And I'm thinking, if that's true, then whether that renders this kind of entropy as telos of all existing objects in our universe, and if that's ruled out by your clause on other possible worlds. Because the motivation for this question is that if it renders entropy as telos of objects, then it makes the idea for me a bit counterintuitive.
Well, life is very often described not by crazy metaphysicians, but sometimes by biologists themselves as a form of negative entropy or anti-entropy or whatever, negentropy. So I don't see it as a necessary consequence of my view. I mean, to the extent that one can view negative entropy as a form of plasticity, directedness, and so on, I don't think that so I mean, if the second law is true, then and everything falls apart in the end, and I guess that will to some extent qualify as a form of teleology, in my view. Perhaps not a very interesting one, but I don't think that threatens a robust teleological view of living organisms, for example. So maybe I misunderstood the question, but I'm going to move on to the first one because we still have time is up and we still have a written question in the queue. So the first question was whether the fundamental physical entities could be
could have an irreducible property of having a telos, and if then that would make it compatible with modern science, because everything else could be reduced to those irreducible particles.
I think that ties back to Hull's question about the compass, or at least in my head, the two are connected. The question is whether these relatively primitive physical systems could qualify as plastic in the sense that I try to indicate. And I'm not entirely clear on that yet, but I would like, I hope the answer is no, but if the answer is yes, then I'm prepared to buy the bullet and say that, well, that's just a very primitive form of teleology that is not the one that we're interested in. All right, our last question comes from Elena Popa. You described domesticated teleology, particularly its extrinsic character, in relation to selected effects functions, for example, Garson's theory. Do you think that may work for other theories of biological functions, such as causal role, where functions explained in relation to the workings of a system as opposed to evolutionary history? Would that support your approach in the sense that in the philosophy of biology, teleology is used in a non-spooky way? I'm not entirely sure what the causal role theory of functions is. If one theory I'm familiar of, and you may be referring to that, is the fitness contribution theory, which is the idea that something has a function if it contributes to the fitness of the organism. That would be a theory on which having a function is intrinsic to the organism, or its goals are intrinsic to the organism. But on my view, that would be still typically a domesticated form of teleology, because it's presumably reducible to, so the way a biological system acquires fitness is presumably, on the standard reductive view, of a result of the way its biochemical parts work together. So it's a reducible form of directedness, and hence it can qualify as a domesticated form teleology. If some biologists were to put forward the view that the fitness properties of organisms do not supervene on the properties of their microparts, that I think would be quite spooky, but I'm not aware of anyone doing things like that. But on the other hand, I'm quite ignorant of the philosophy of biology. All right, our time is up. So thanks for everyone for participating, for these great questions. And next week, we're going to have Howard Robinson on about Aristotelian dualism versus hylomorphism. So thanks again, and have a nice weekend.